Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Luca Sprues. Today's video is going to be the first in a continuing series where I look at restoring some dioramas at the Queensland Air Museum. So basically about a month or two back, me and another friend of mine, Riles Hubbard, who do the model kits there, were tasked with restoring some displays that were made by the Pathfinders Association. So looking at the World War II British night bombers that were part of the Pathfinder force. So basically, over the following months, and it's still continuing as of the making of this video, however we are pretty close to finishing, we slowly restored some of the displays that needed a little bit of TLC. So in this video, we'll be looking at fixing up an old Airfix 1/72nd scale Handly Page Halifax. But before that, I'll do a little bit of talking about the background to this project and some of the research I did on this particular kit. So if you want to skip that and just get into the restoration, I'll leave a little link to the section of the video where we start talking about restoring the aircraft, and I'll also leave a link in the description to Tectonic Hobbies, where you can buy all of the supplies and diorama accessories that I used to restore these displays. So without further ado, let's get into this one. So there's around about 8 different dioramas at the Air Museum that we fixed up, and I will be covering doing some of the other ones in some future videos. They are all located in the entrance hangar just to the left-hand side of the F-111. The dioramas all focus on a particular airfield in England called Rath Gravelly, and this was home to 2 squadrons of Pathfinder forces during World War II. They were 35th Squadron, who flew the Handly Page Halifax, and later on the Avro Lancaster, and 692 Squadron, who flew the de Havilland Mosquito. Both the 2 squadrons were part of 8th Group, known as the Pathfinders, and these were the aircraft and aircrews that had the unenviable job of flying to the target first before the larger group of bombers came behind them. Once there, they would then drop marker flares and figure out which ones were landing most accurately, and then guide the main force in, sometimes even sticking around during the raid. The Pathfinder force would pioneer a lot of night navigation techniques, have a lot of Australian crews, and were in fact led by an Australian, which is one of the reasons this display is so prominent. There are some other displays in the museum that are dedicated to said Aussie commander, whose name was Donald Bennett. I must say, I'm a little surprised I didn't know anything about Don Bennett before doing research for this project. Not only did the man lead the Pathfinder force from its creation in 1942 up until the end of the war, but before the war he flew for Imperial Airways, even flying the very unusual short Mayo, and he literally wrote the book on navigation flight training before the war broke out. After the war, he flew for several civilian airlines, spent about 73 days working in the British Parliament, and started his own car and aircraft making company. But we won't be talking about that today. But getting back to the Halifax diorama, which researching was a little bit tricky. You see, 35th Squadron was started out in 1942 and flew the Handly Page Halifax Mark I and Mark II. However, these were the Merlin-powered variant, and the kit was a Airfix one, which was the Mark III, which is powered by 4 Bristol Hercules radial engines. Now, 35th Squadron did fly the Mark III for a short period before replacing the Halifax with the Lancaster. However, it's difficult to find any photos of them. I can find plenty of Mark Is and Mark IIs. You can clearly tell it's 35th Squadron by the letters TL as the squadron code. However, I could only find a single photo of a Mark III from the Australian War Memorial. I could read that the letter code for the aircraft was L, and the aircraft also appeared to have an interesting piece of nose art, which appeared to show Superman with the words "Easy Does It" around him. So I decided to base the new aircraft completely off this photo and make my own decals, and this is how I did it. So the first step for restoring the diorama was to remove everything from the board. I'll cover fixing up the diorama board and the vehicles in a separate video at some point, but instead we'll focus on the Halifax for today. So once I'd removed the Handly page from the diorama base, I then started to break it up into sections. For the most part, the aircraft disintegrated itself, so it must have been quite old and brittle, but I did sometimes use the hobby knife to separate a few pieces. Once I'd completely dismantled the bomber, I then took it back to my evil lair to do some work on it. Since the aircraft was on the ground, I decided to leave the crew figures out, since they wouldn't board the aircraft until it was ready for flying. I disassembled all of the propeller blades and got the cockpit interior parts ready. So first of all, I got some Tamiya paint remover, and dipping a cotton bud in it, I then applied it all over the model. I started out with the interior just to test what this product was like since I hadn't used it, and I found it was very good at doing what it was obviously designed to, which is, as the name explains, remove paint. So I stripped all the paint from the interior, which was a little bit of a weird shade, and then I later on proceeded to remove the paint from the entire aircraft. I used some gloves to protect my hands, and basically after applying the paint remover with the cotton tip, I then used some paper towel to strip it off. This was a pretty easy process, but it was fairly time consuming. It probably took me at least an hour or two to remove all the paint from the aircraft. Now, the reason I was removing all of the paint was so I could do a better job of it myself and also make it more accurate. The camouflage pattern on the original aircraft appeared to be applied in some of the wrong places, and the yellow and black markings on the tail would not have been present on 35th Squadron aircraft, as that was a different squadron's markings. I also felt that the shades of green and brown used were a little bit inaccurate. And after a bit of work, I basically had a fresh kit to start off with. There were a few small areas where the paint was, but it didn't bother me too much. Now that I'd disassembled the Halifax, the first step to reassembling it was to add some extra details. I decided, since it was getting loaded up for a mission, to have the bomb bay doors open, and I wanted to add some extra detailing to the cockpit. The main things I did to do this was to cut out some pieces of thin styrofoam sheet and glue it onto the sidewall to recreate the ribbing and various bulkheads. Other little accessories such as thin pieces of copper wire and some bits of matchstick and wood were used to create the other details. I used a very similar technique in the bomb bay of using styrofoam strips to create the ribbing, and also a few spare parts were used for the bomb racks. For the polystyrene sheets, you can just glue them to the model using some Revell Contactor Professional, or if you prefer the brush, you can use the Tamiya stuff. For the wood and metal wiring, I used Gorilla Superglue. And I have a few pictures of what the cockpit and the bomb bay looked like without any paint, and as you can see, it's definitely an improvement over the Airfix kit, even if it is a little bit basic. I painted the forward section of the fuselage 2 coats of Tamiya XF71 cockpit green, and the rear section 2 coats of XF16 flat aluminium. Other colours such as flat black, flat white, yellow and red, along with some flat earth, were used for the interior details. Once the interior was complete, I then glued the fuselage halves back together and held them in place with masking tape. I also reassembled the landing gear and joined the wing half sections back together again. It wasn't too long before I joined the fuselage and the wings together, and despite the age and the fact that the aircraft had been taken apart, the fit was still quite good. I then began to paint the camouflage pattern for the aircraft. I began this by painting the underside Tamiya XF1 flat black. I used the largest brush possible to reduce visible brush strokes and make sure the paint is nice and thin. I also painted the inside of the bomb bay flat black. I did about 2 coats of flat black before moving on to the next colour on the upper surface. I used a similar technique to paint 2 coats of Tamiya Dark Green 2 or RAF Green. You'll notice a little bit more clearly how I apply the paint. I try to, as much as possible, apply it in the direction air would flow over the model. This helps to reduce visible brush strokes since you create nice uniform layers when you build them up. Unfortunately, as I was painting with the green, it became apparent that there was a nasty seam line down the middle of the aircraft, so I got out some Vallejo putty once I'd finished that coat of paint and applied it using a small cocktail stick. I then smoothed it over using my fingers, which fortunately is easy to clean up since it's a water-based putty, unlike the Tamiya stuff. I applied a 3rd coat of Tamiya XF1 flat black before applying the camouflage on the upper surface. Unfortunately, I lost the footage for doing that step, however I will be covering painting Royal Air Force colours in some upcoming videos, so stay tuned for those. The other thing I unfortunately didn't manage to record was applying the decals. I created some custom decals using the program GIMP based on the pictures I had. In terms of the colours for the nose art, a little bit of creative licensing had to be used, however I think I got a relatively accurate result. I then applied the decals onto the model, but since I used white decal paper to print them out, the edges where there was no ink would appear as white, so I had to then paint them over using flat black. And as you can see, the result is not too bad. Even if there is a tiny bit of mess around the decals, I think it looks quite realistic. With the markings and decals out of the way, I could move on to focusing on the smaller details. The engines had previously been left unpainted, so I decided to fix that. I painted them a coat of Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium, and then I got a fine brush and painted X33 bronze on the trims around the engines. The exhaust covers then also received a coat of Tamiya X31 titanium gold. The original Airfix kit's clear parts posed a bit of a problem. Not only were they lacking in details for things such as the frames around the cockpit, but they were also incredibly untransparent and there was a lot of distortion. For the smaller windows, I decided to use a little bit of PVA glue dabbed in with a cocktail stick and then spread around to make it nice and thin. This is a little bit tricky to get right and it's not exactly perfect, but it was a huge step above from the original Airfix clear parts that were too thick to see anything out of. As for the other windows for the cockpit, the bombardier's compartment and the turrets, I instead was going to use a vacuum-formed kit, but we'll get to that later. I painted the spinners for the propeller XF16 flat aluminium and put them in place. And here you can see the difference between the Airfix and the vacuum-formed kit parts. As you can see, the vacuum-formed parts have a lot more clarity and are much better. I very carefully painted the mid-upper turrets, the rear turret and the nose glazing frames using Tamiya XF1 flat black and a very fine brush, and I used some XF81 dark green for the cockpit section. When you are done painting, any mistakes can be scratched off using a cocktail stick when you use acrylic paints such as the Tamiya ones, since they scratch relatively easily. I sanded the edges of the vacuum parts before gluing them to the aircraft using a little bit of Super Gorilla Glue. Unfortunately, I believe some of the excess glue, or perhaps the lack of ventilation, caused the super glue to make a little bit of the edges of the vacuum parts fog up. This was only very subtle and overall much better than the Airfix kit's original parts still. I then began the weathering process. I used a variety of techniques to apply some metallic chipping in the form of Tamiya XF16, such as using a sponge and dabbing it along the edges of the wings to create some nice large chipping patterns, and a fine brush to get some finer details around things such as the flight controls and the various access hatches and ports. You'll also notice that I drilled out a hole for the fuel tank, and this was so that later on when I was building the rest of the diorama I could have someone refueling the aircraft. I also painted the machine guns flat aluminium while I had the fine brush. As well as drilling out the fuel tank and opening up the bomb bays to make the diorama more interesting, I also drilled out the rear access hatch. It's a bit crazy to think that this is pretty much the only hatch the crew have to get in and out of the aircraft. Metal chipping was also applied to the elevators, the small flight control linkages, the rudders, and also around the landing gear and the engines. The final area to receive some chipping was the bomb bay, the various access hatches on the wings, and also on the blades of the propellers. After I'd finished, I felt like I'd applied a little bit too much chipping, so I went along with some XF52 and XF81 and covered up some of the excess chips. Some heavily watered down flat black was then applied onto the machine guns to help highlight the details and add some gun smoke effects, and some XF2 flat white was trailed behind the exhausts, and once it had dried a little wiped off with a cotton bud. Then a thin coat of XF1 flat black was applied over the top, and this was to create some burning streaks from the exhaust fumes. And with the exhaust streaks done, the model was finally completed. I then placed it into its newly designed display base, and this is the final result. So as you can see, a lot of improvements have been made, such as the camouflage being more accurate in terms of both colour and its pattern, a lot more of the details painted, and a fair bit more weathering and character added to the model. In a future video, we'll look at making the new diorama base, which as you can see has a lot more grass and is now concrete rather than dirt, and I will also cover doing the vehicles and the crew. So, thank you very much for watching this one. I do hope you got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and, of course, subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or suggestions for my modelling, please be sure to leave them down in the comments section below. And I'd like to give a very big thank you to my wonderful patrons who help support my channel financially. If you want to see some of the exclusive content and get early access to videos, be sure to check out my Patreon page. But until the next video, take care and model on.